Hi everybody. Today we're going to have a little lesson about watercolor and watercolor paints. Okay. First I wanted to share with you that the different kinds of paints we have in our world today, of course there's numerous, all right, is watercolor paints, tempera paints, poster paints that are all water-based. Okay. They all really come out of the same kind of pigments. Years ago they were made from plants, crushed seeds mixed with some sand and water, and that's how we got our watercolor paints. Okay. Then we have gone into oil paints. Oil paints came also from plants, but oil was added. Different plants, corn we know is used and can make oil. Okay, so different plants produce an oil solution, and that is added to the pigments, and that makes an oil paint. Then all of a sudden we discovered polymer, which is a plastic, which is acrylic. Okay, and so paints and acrylics and using plastics in our paint has changed the whole world with regards to art, okay, and making art and everything else commercial, okay, because plastics, most of our plastic toys and everything are made with colors. Today we're going to concentrate on the art of watercolor and watercolor techniques, okay. Watercolor has been around and used by every single group of people in the world from the beginning of time. It is people's nature to draw in the sand and to take things and make things from other things, and it was our nature as a human race to discover and to make images and things and forms and lines and designs with whatever plant life you could find and create an image and a paint color. Okay, so hence we have watercolors. Watercolors are a stain. They bite your paper, so they leave a stain. This is your watercolor paper here. Watercolor papers are thicker than a normal paper because you want your paper to absorb the water and the paint. The art of watercolor is the art of playing with water and paint. And you do it in 4 different levels of applying paint and water to your painting. Okay, excuse me. So this is a watercolor, and you could see through it. And here on the front is something that I did because I started with some classes today showing watercolor and the art of technique of watercolor painting. Here is 1. Here is 2, and I'm going to go over all of these with you in a second. And here is 3. None of them are finished yet, okay? In this assignment, in this little video, you won't see a finished one, maybe a partial finished one, okay? So, the art of watercolor, as I told you, is playing with water. A lot of water, a little paint. Then more water with more paint. Then a lot of paint and little water. And then little paint and little water. That last one is the last thing that we call pulling our picture together. It's outlining, showing shadows, showing shading, showing different 3D effects that you want to achieve when you're in your finished product. Okay. The first thing that artists do is they take their watercolor paper and they wet it. So you put it in the sink and it's dripping wet. Okay. I am going to use a paintbrush for the sake of easiness because we're making a video. So I am wetting the paper. Actually, I'm on the wrong one. Now, when you wet paper, it curdles and ripples. So you have to take masking tape and tape your paper to the table, to a board, which I'll show you what I'm on. And so now I am wetting the paper. Now, watercolor happens in 4 times. Most watercolorists apply their paint 7 times, and I'll explain what I mean in a minute. So here you have masking tape, and you put the masking tape down either to your table. I happen to be on a Masonite board. I'll show you the back of it. Okay, so here's the board. You can use any board you want. And you tape your paper down so it doesn't curdle. And when you take the paper off, you don't take the tape off. You don't take the tape off from the paper, you take the tape off from the board or the table where you've taped your picture, okay? The first layer of watercolor paint is a lot of water and a little bit of paint. Actually, sorry, a lot of water and a lot of paint. Not paint where you're worried about darkness. It's called a wash. So you're using a lot of water and a lot of paint. It's not supposed to be dark. This is not your last time working on this picture. So tons of water, little paint. And artists call this a wash. Okay? So you're washing your paper. Now you're not making it dark. It is the background. It is the wash. Okay? Why? Because you want this paint to bite the paper. As it dries, it leaves a stain mark. You know, if you have raspberries or strawberries or a cup of tea and you spill that, in fact, artists paint with tea bags, by the way. Okay? So a lot of water and a little paint. Excuse me. A lot of water and a lot of paint to make it wishy-washy and drippy. Okay? So here's one I did, and that's the first layer, and it's called a wash. Now, if you look under this one that I did with the first class today, you'll see underneath it the wash. Now, the wash, when it dries, stains the paper right here. See? So these marks are like a stain in the paper, so that when you go back to paint, you outline it and you add more on it to enhance it. And that's how we say this. So we add, the first row is a lot of water, a lot of paint, a little water, a little paint, okay? Then a little paint and a little bit more water. And then your finishing touch to finish the picture, okay, is little bit of paint with almost no water. And that's outlining. So here I'm gonna leave this here. It's dripping, okay? And I'm going to take the back of this one and I'm gonna put it down on top to show you the next layer. Now, if we look at this one first, before I turn it over, you will see how the paint stained the paper. See? Now, what we do as artists is we take this and we outline this. Okay, now I'm gonna turn this over and you'll see I have more paint dripping here. Okay, I'm gonna wait and see what happens when it dries. Okay, so right now I'm gonna go back to this. So now, this dried for a couple of hours. I can add more on it. Okay, I have no idea what I'm painting here today. All right, probably because of the colors I used and the sky or something, I don't know. Probably, you know, Mrs. Knight paints her trees and stuff. We're doing a video. Okay, sorry, we're doing watercolor. Okay, so what we're gonna do now I didn't tape this down. Was that too rude?
No, you're fine.
So I'm taping this down because it's curdling. And now I'm gonna add on a little more detail. Didn't pull enough. So watercolorists, you know, there was no white pigment. So watercolorists did not use white paint. And in fact, until the 1900s, no one had a word for the word pink, and no one had a word for, what was I gonna say? No one had a word for how do we do this, okay? And no one had a word on how to fill in the white spaces because there was no white paint. So what watercolorists used to do and painters used to do is they would leave certain areas of their painting white. And then they would take dirty water and paint in the white area and get a color, and that would make it light, okay? So that's how they would make snow or the sky. They wouldn't add much paint. Still a lot of water and a little paint. So now, there are different paints to use for watercolor paints. One is these. They come in cakes. They come in a box that you could buy at the 99-cent store, and they come like this that I use in the art room. They've been used through the centuries, every country in the world, okay? Another kind of watercolor paint, it comes in a tube. Now, this is different than an acrylic paint or an oil paint, because if this dries up, I can cut the tube, put in a wet paintbrush, and I will have watercolor paint. But you cannot do that with acrylic because it's plastic, and the oil paint dries up, not unless you add a turpentine to it to get it oily and paint again, okay? Another kind of paint that has become on the market lately in the last 50 years are watercolor pencils. You could tell them because they have a paintbrush on them. So you can dip the watercolor paintbrush in water and paint and draw with it, okay? Or you can just draw with it, and then you'll see I'm gonna add on Mrs. Knight and her crazy trees and her doodle lines, okay? So I'm using my wash as a base. So for your assignment, every single paper must have a wash on first. I must be able to see the watercolor stain and then how you work on it and embellish it, okay? There, watercolor pencils. Now, what else is watercolor? Well, Crayola's come out with a new thing on the market. They're called watercolor oil pastels, okay? And you draw with them. And they're an oxymoron. That means opposites because it's a watercolor but a pastel, okay? Now, you add water on it, it becomes a paint. So it blends in. Now the difference of this so this is a paint. This has become a paint. It's a watercolor. You could see it blends in. Okay? Not a lot, but it blends in so it adds a texture. A lot of watercolorists spend a lot of time trying to find texture. Well, how do you make salt? Excuse me, how do you make snow? And they use salt, okay? So this is a watercolor oil pastel. Now, to create a texture, you can use an oil pastel that is not water-based. So if you see me drawing in this, this will not melt down. It will not dissolve, okay? So I'll get a texture in my grasses. Now, I'll show you, I'll put some paint on top in a minute and show you the effect. And a crayon, okay? A crayon is made with wax. Therefore, it won't dissolve in water. An oil pastel is made with oil. Therefore, it won't dissolve in water. See, I'm having trouble coloring with the crayon on wet. Here it's not wet, so we'll see. Now, I'm gonna take a paintbrush and I'm gonna add green paint in my grasses. A little more paint now, not wishy-washy. And I'm stroking. So you'll see as it dries that the oil pastel gets immersed into it, but, excuse me, the watercolor oil pastel gets immersed into it, but not the watercolor, not the oil pastel itself. It leaves a texture, okay? Now, the same thing is gonna happen with the crayons because wax and water don't mix, right? They don't dissolve. So here I'm gonna paint with a little green, more paint on my brush, not water here, on top of where I put the brown crayons to show you that you're going to still see the brown and it won't dissolve. Okay? So, next thing to know. Markers. Let's say you have no money and you have no paint, but you have markers at home. Well, guess what? Markers are made, they're water-based. So if you draw with the markers on your page, okay? So I'm gonna add on, I'm gonna make like lilacs. Now you don't put it in water now because it'll ruin it, and that's what I've started to do. So let me try this one. But you see what happens? This becomes paint. Now when I add on water, it's painted. It smears. It blends. It dissolves, whatever word you want to use. The more water, the more the marker will dissolve. And same thing with the watercolor pencil. Okay, so now, with the watercolor paints, this is one I started this morning. So the whole idea is, as I look at this picture, I need to add more on it, okay? So I'm gonna turn it around. I'm not putting it down flat because this is wet. And I'm just gonna enhance it with my watercolor pencil. Okay, so I'm gonna draw with the watercolor pencil here very quickly. And I'm also gonna outline different parts where I see it stained. Okay, so your job is going to be to see what you did in your picture. And then you add on as your picture dries. That's what the art of watercolor is. So this is a watercolor pencil that I'm doing this with. Now look, over here, see this ridges here, the green? Oh, it looks like mountains. So I'm gonna outline it with my watercolor pencil. And so my picture is starting to formulate. I'm gonna take my paintbrush, I'm gonna add more in now, and we'll see what happens. See the paints? The watercolor paints. And so I'm adding on layers. So most watercolorists paint on their picture about 7 times to get their finished picture. So they have to wait. So like most artists, when they're waiting, they're restless and they still want to make art. So you start another picture. That's why I have 4 pictures here. Okay, so I can work. So in reality, I can finish all 4 about the same time, maybe a half an hour in between each, depending on what my outlining is. So the last set on a watercolor is little paint, little water, and that's used for heightening. So I'm gonna let this dry for a minute. So my picture is starting to form. So tomorrow I can add more onto it. Now, here I am with this, and I want to add some more texture, and I want to see what happens with some other stuff. So, this is liquid watercolor, okay? I don't know if you're aware, in the art world now, the latest thing is to do pouring, paint pouring. And what paint pouring is, acrylic paint that has been diluted with a little chemical, okay, that dissolves the plastic, and then artists pour it on stuff, all right? They let it dry a little with a hair dryer or put it in the microwave, and then they add on a plastic. So it's called paint pouring. It's the latest rage. But actually it started with the art of watercolor. So here is liquid watercolor, almost like an ink, and I'm gonna drip it. Okay, now my paper is not too wet, so I'm gonna have to make it wet in a minute. So this is a stain. Remember, watercolor paints are a stain. So I'm going to drip some of this. Okay, now, I taped it to the table. I can't pick it up. But if you look here, it's dissolving because it's in water. But now, I'm just going to splash water all over it. Now, when you're at home in your own space, okay, you can have an eye droplet. You can have a turkey baster. If your mother dyes her hair, you can save the bottles and spray. You can have a spray left over from some spray thing. And so here we go. And here we have this. And I'm going to play around with it a little. And see what happens. Now, the other thing that's going to happen is many watercolorists love texture. And so what they did, okay, is they started to apply different things when they started to add, they did a wash, okay? And then after they did the wash, then they enhanced it a little with a little more paint and a little more water. Then while it was wet, they figured out, oh, we need to put some more stuff in here. So they take a sponge, they take rolled piece of paper, saran wrap, wax paper, aluminum foil, and they started dabbing. And the dabbing gives a print. So if you were doing snow, or you're doing a storm, or water, you would dab it and you'd be able to create certain images all while your watercolor base paper is still wet. Then they would add on salt. Okay? Salt, as you know, crystallizes in water. Okay? So they take a little bit of salt and put pinches of salt where the water is. And if you look closely, remember I told you all the time, art relates everything in the world. So here we have nature, landscape, science, all in the same thing, in the same lesson. So these are called resists, okay? So the salt starts to crystallize and we wait for it to dry. When it's dry, it falls off a little, and then your last layer of paint is a thin paintbrush, a lot of paint, and a little bit of water, and you work with what you created in staining your papers. And that's how we do watercolor painting.